everybody. I'm Jim Sievers from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. On behalf of the Institute and our co-sponsors, the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and the Global Human Development Program, I want to welcome you to today's discussion of foreign news coverage and diplomacy with Dr. Jack Hamilton. This is a set of issues that we are thinking a lot about, we should be thinking a lot about at the School of Foreign Service, all over the university. Some of the questions, how are our students, faculty, staff, everybody getting their news about the world? What's the rest of the country doing in getting their news? What are the implications of all of the answers to those questions for everyone's understanding of the world? This key thing that we always hear about, journalism struggling to remain profitable in the internet age. What does that mean for the quality, quantity of international reporting, of foreign news gathering? How does that affect all of our understanding of the world, analysis of what's going on globally? These are hard questions, and I don't know that anybody has a definitive answer. But if anybody does, it's Dr. Jack Hamilton. Really a distinguished author, journalist, scholar. He is a professor in LSU's Manship School of Mass Communication. He was the founding dean there. He's a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars. He's worked as a reporter all over the world and for many different places, the Milwaukee Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, ABC Radio. He was a longtime commentator for a program that I love to listen to every day, Marketplace, on NPR. He's also has a government practitioner's perspective on all these questions, having been a staff member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, an advisor on foreign aid in the State Department, and also working in the World Bank. A book to recommend to help sort out all these issues, published a few years ago by Dr. Hamilton, A Journalism's Roving Eye, A History of American News Gathering Abroad. I was, in preparing for listening to this interesting discussion today, I was looking online and saw one of the talks that had been given before by Jack. And he noted that the real history of foreign news gathering abroad is one of steady evolution. And not every step has been a step forward. That made me feel better, this idea about we have an evolutionary process going on. And I really look forward today to hearing more about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going on foreign news coverage, and what it means to all of us in terms of understanding the world. So thank you, Dr. Hamilton.
So I appreciate there's such a nice turnout. I assumed it was really cold outside, and you can come get warm and eat. That's probably the real attraction. I'm going to try to deliver this informally, although I have some notes here because I want to make sure I make certain points. And after I'm going to not talk so long if there can't be questions, because in my experience, especially with a group with so many knowledgeable people as there are here, I'm sure there'll be good questions and really good comments. Can everybody see me? Am I okay? And can I be heard? Am I doing okay? Okay. I also want to say I'm very pleased to be here because my son is a graduate of the school, and very proud that he went here, and I'm very impressed with the support he got from the faculty here. There were people on the staff who really helped him on his career, and he's now a diplomat. I thought it would be appropriate to start, since we're in the era, another era where we're going to elect a new pope, to give you a pope story. So there's a very famous journalist in the end of the 19th century named James Creelman, a person I actually particularly like. He was quite a character, very big name during the Spanish-American War, worked for William Randolph Hearst, which of course many of you know would mean he was of the yellow journalism persuasion. And around 1880, he went and did an interview with the Pope. And I particularly like this story because during the interview with the Pope, the Pope says to him, "So, are you a Catholic?" And he says, "No, Your Holiness. I am what journalism has made me." And the reason I like that is, there's three reasons why I like this. First of all, it's a wonderful example of sort of the joie de vivre of foreign correspondence and the fact they have adventures. The second thing I like is it's a good little benchmark in the history of journalism, because although we take interviews for granted today, as a matter of fact, interviews were very rare. And the reason he had this interview, and he was very proud of it, was he said he was the first person to have interviewed a pope. First American journalist to interview a pope. In fact, Americans invented the concept of interviews. It was American journalists that came up with that idea. It was not something they inherited, say, from the British. In fact, the British rather thought it was inappropriate to be going and trying to interview people and get them to say things that made news. The other thing I like about the interview is that Creelman was wrong. It wasn't the first time that somebody had interviewed a pope. He was the second American journalist to have interviewed a pope. And so it is a good way to get into the history of journalism, because it tells us something very important. A lot of what these journalists like to say about themselves, and of course foreign correspondents have written wonderful, colorful, and fascinating books about what they do, they're often wrong. One of the most glorified room in the mansion of journalism is that occupied by foreign correspondents. There was an encyclopedia done in 1928 by the Chicago Tribune, kind of an example, by the way, of it being in its heyday. And so they defined what a foreign correspondent was, and they said in this very thick book, by the way, it said, "If to this business of getting out a great daily newspaper there still clings any of the aura of romance which once surrounded all newspapers and all newspaper men, it is the foreign correspondents who get the greater share of it." The fact is, however, that foreign correspondents have ended up being traitors. Robert Best ended up working for the Nazis, even though I think he'd been with Associated Press or United Press beforehand. There are journalists, and I'll mention one later, the Stanley who went to find Livingston, who used to make up news all the time and did other things that blotted his copybook. There are journalists who are lazy, and there are journalists who just get things wrong. And sometimes there are whole packs of journalists who get things wrong. For example, coverage of the war in Vietnam was abysmal, as we all know. No foreign correspondents really wrote about the coming war, World War I. And in fact, once the war broke out, most journalists, in fact, really all Western journalists, were in Paris writing a story about a trial that was going on that had to do with somebody's wife having love letters to someone else who was in the government. So foreign correspondence has had its glory moments, but it's also had its weak moments. And to really understand what foreign reporting is about, we need to understand the problems as well as what's been good. What I thought I'd do today is really three things, and this was sort of already, I think, picked up on by the nice introduction. To say a little bit about the evolution. I don't think you can understand today what's happening today without understanding how we got here. To talk about how things are today and how I would argue how complicated it is. And then because of this audience, I thought I'd say a little bit about what some of the implications are for diplomacy. Foreign news coverage has always been an experimentation. It's not generally known, but the first newspaper to have a great core of foreign correspondence was the Chicago Daily News. It wasn't the New York Times. And in fact, you could argue that the inventor of modern American journalism was really the Chicago Daily News. For some strange reason, even though it had wonderful writers on that paper, its story has never really been told, which is unfortunate. But anyway, the Daily News, at the end of the Spanish, our incursion into the Spanish-American War, decided to put together a core of foreign correspondents who would go abroad and systematically cover the world and be stationed abroad for long durations of time. Victor Lawson, who was the genius behind the Chicago Daily News, the owner, described his work in letters to people as largely an experiment, because no one had ever really done this before. And to give you an example of what an experiment it was, at one point he decided that what he would do in order to make people interested in Great Britain, for example, was run a column that appeared every week called Queer Sprigs of Gentility,
which was obviously a column that would never appear today, and thank God it didn't appear for very long, but it was a column that described what was happening with the nobility in England, and meant to be rather cute, but ended up being rather trivial. Nevertheless, when Lawson was done, he had assembled one of the great corps of foreign correspondents in American history, and I'll say a little bit more about him in a minute because he illustrates some of the points I want to talk about. Now, of course, we look today and we see, and I think we need to say this before we get back to the beginning, we look at where we are today and we decry the fact that all kinds of, the numbers of foreign correspondents seem to have gone down dramatically. The Chicago Tribune, which had, well, there's no Chicago Daily News anymore at all. Chicago Tribune's correspondence has effectively disappeared. It's all been put together into one with a whole conglomerate of newspapers. The Philadelphia Newsday and the Baltimore Sun, which had very important small bureaus or corps of foreign correspondents, have disappeared completely. You look at the weekly news magazines, which used to have foreign correspondents, and of course, what's happened now is they have a lot of people who comment on foreign news, but they don't do reporting, which is a big thing. To show you I've become not just a journalist, but I've managed to get myself really into academic work. To show you the detail I went through, I once measured, I actually had a graduate student do this, the W in World in US News and World Report, to find out how much smaller over a period of time, because this gradually happened, how the W got smaller and smaller as the years went on. Before it ceased publication altogether as an ink-on-paper newspaper in 2009, it didn't have any foreign correspondence at all. But the point was that the W got to be, depending on how you measured it by height or total mass, had gotten to be a tiny fraction of what the other rest of the report was about, which was indicative of what was happening. So what's the history? How did we get here? First of all, the high water point of American foreign reporting, measured in terms of amount of foreign news in newspapers, was in colonial America. It was at a time when we had no editors and we had no reporters. What we had was colonial printers who had newspapers, and when ships came in from overseas, they would offload both newspapers from Great Britain and other places, and they would offload letters of people, true foreign correspondents, who had written back to the colonies, and they would publish them in their newspapers. It was not unusual for Benjamin Franklin's newspaper, which was not the first, but one of the first, to actually have the entire front page and parts of the inside all foreign news. Now, you know, sometimes by our standards, some of this was rather bizarre. One of my favorite examples of that being one newspaper would always insist on publishing the oldest news first. So if they couldn't fill up the paper they had too much news to fill up the paper, they wouldn't start with the newest news. They start with the oldest news, because then next week they fill you in and bring you up to date on the oldest news, something that, of course, journalists today would never do. A second period happens around about the middle of the 19th century, when we get to the point of having mass market media. And I'm going to say more about this in a minute. But once you had to make money from selling news and you had to pay for foreign reporting, things began to change. And so we began to see a sort of a pattern that sets in motion. We started seeing special correspondents. Those were correspondents who actually worked for a newspaper. They were called, and still are by many people, the specials. One of the great ones was George Wilkins Kendall of the New Orleans Times-Picayune, who covered the war in Mexico in 1846 and did such an extraordinary job that newspapers all over the United States used his copy. They sent it up by Pony Express. And one of the reasons that he was so effective was, in addition to having actually riders in Mexico take the copy to the coast, he also had ships meet the boats that were bringing his stories to New Orleans with typesetting equipment on the boats, and they'd set the type on the boats so when they landed they could have the stories right out on the street. Next was our friend Henry Stanley, who made news by finding Dr. Livingston in East Africa for the New York Herald. The most important part of that story, that actually is a story he actually got and didn't make up, which is to his credit, what's more interesting is that James Gordon Bennett, who had sent him, actually sent him and then forgot he sent him, then decided he'd send him some money so he could keep looking for Livingston, but was always very jealous of the fact that Livingston had, Stanley had gone and gotten the story, and felt that Bennett should get much more credit. It's also interesting if you look at the stories that there is no byline on Stanley's stories. They're all told in the first person, but there's no byline. But the point was that the Herald went out and tried to get news. James Gordon Bennett expended a lot of money to go out and get foreign news and use it as a competitive advantage for his newspaper. There's another character who's forgotten named George Smalley, a wonderful journalist who was a master of organization. He set up a permanent bureau in London for the New York Tribune, and he was very famous for what he called his methods, which was ways to organize coverage of major events, including wars. One of his great accomplishments was to actually outfox William Howard Russell, who was the famous correspondent of the Times of London in the Franco-Prussian War. And he set a stage for the idea that you had to organize news. You just don't send somebody out there. But when you're going after a big story, you've got to put a lot of different people in place, and you've got to devise strategies to get the news from the battlefield to, in this case, London, and then back to New York. The next stage comes with our friend Victor Lawson, the Chicago Daily News. His corps of foreign correspondents were eventually syndicated. Their work was syndicated to more than 100 newspapers. And he set the stage for what would be a serious foreign service, as it were. The first Pulitzer Prize ever given in the category of foreign reporting was to Paul Scott Maurer, one of the great journalists of the 20th century. And as a matter of fact, his brother, who was also on the paper, Edgar Ansel Maurer, won it 3 years later for covering the Nazis. I'm going to say more about Maurer later. But by the way, if anybody wants to read a wonderful book, you ought to read a book called Our Foreign Affairs, written in the early 20s by Maurer. It predicts the way the world was going to go with amazing accuracy, including predicting energy crisis. Then we had what I would call the golden age of journalism, the period between the two world wars. And there were lots of reasons for this. One was there were lots and lots, even though we think of that as a period of American isolationism, there were lots of foreign correspondents abroad in that period. They were not only with newspapers and news services, of which there were many, which don't even exist today, like the International News Service and the United Press and Associated Press and Consolidated Press. There were a long list of them. There were also magazines that sent reporters abroad and gave them a huge freedom to write. And because the cost of living abroad were relatively so cheap, with the amount of money you were paid by these magazines, for example, and given the fact that living was so cheap, you could stay abroad and live quite comfortably on your salary. An example I like to use is a guy named Edgar Snow, who was also one of the great reporters of the 20th century who covered China. And he wrote his first story for the Saturday Evening Post in 1935. And he got $750 for that story, which is kind of a lot of money in those days, and was able to pay his entire food bill and his rent for the entire year on $750. Also, it was a time when we had radio coming on, which made a difference. And it was also a time when, and this is, I think, very important to all of us, in all kinds of capacities, not just journalism, and not least of all diplomacy, it was a period in American history where Americans were really liked overseas. And it gave journalists tremendous entree. One of the reasons that Edgar Snow did so well is he was the first to write about Mao and the Chinese Communist Revolution. Nobody really knew what it was about till he went up to Bao'an to interview Mao Zedong and others. And the reason they wanted him was he was an objective reporter and he was an American. And he wrote for important news outlets. Today, being an American newspaper man or woman is not necessarily a reason to get invited to have a good story. Now, American journalists are often targets. And then, of course, there's another thing that made that a golden age, and that was there were very important stories going on. The run-up to World War II, the rise of communism, fascism, a recognition of growing interdependence, of which the Americans were involved, even if they didn't politically always want to participate. And then we're at today's stage, or I guess I should say perhaps sort of at today's stage and maybe a step behind today. And I would describe these correspondents as the corporate correspondents, and it was a time when news became corporatized to a large extent, that is, having to provide dividends for shareholders. And unlike what had happened previously, journalists now were much more closely managed than they had been before. They were in touch with the Home Office, and their work was coordinated. I'm going to say more about this later because I have some views on it. And it was also, of course, a time when instead of having rising credibility for journalists, there was declining credibility. Things like the war in Vietnam did not help us. And honestly, that was a time when I think foreign correspondents, not all, but many, were less colorful than they had been in a previous era. So if you look at that period, we aren't quite at today yet, but if you look at that period, there are really sort of three issues that cut across what happened in that 200-year period. One has to do with money, one has to do with audience interest, and one has to do with technology. I told you that the colonial newspapers were the first, had the most news. That was, in one way, we can think of that as the high water point in terms of amount of news. And the reason for that was printers just wanted to shovel stuff in newspapers. The audience was a colonial audience that cared about what was going on in Europe, obviously. There was also a reason you didn't want to publish local news, is you didn't want to make the local government unhappy because you didn't have the same press freedoms that we do today. And of course, the news was free. All this news was lifted. It was all pirated. Or if it was a letter, it was given to you to run. Once newspapers started realizing or started becoming serious money-making operations, and that really doesn't happen until about 1840. Prior to that, newspapers there were a few that made a little bit of money, but they charged a relatively high fee, and many of them didn't actually even get paid. And they were run by after the revolution, they were run largely by political parties, so that they were not what we think of today as balanced reporting. But once newspapers started trying to make money, the way James Gordon Bennett did by having the Herald send somebody like Stanley abroad because it would make news and be colorful, everything changes. Very few newspapers from that point on, or any news media, would specialize in or spend a lot of money on foreign news. And the reason was it cost too much. And in addition to that, reader interest was essentially pretty low. So newspapers like the New York Times has a rather elite audience for a mass market newspaper, and so it spends a lot of money on foreign reporting, and still does. But newspapers, lots of newspapers, most newspapers in this country can't afford to pay $250,000 to have a foreign correspondent stationed overseas. And so and remember, you can't have usually just one. And so what happens is they concentrate on local news. And indeed, with the concerns that we have today about the financial health of newspapers, what's happened, of course, is that local has become a kind of mantra for newspapers rather than foreign. There are some exceptions, and we'll talk about that in a minute a little bit. The result is, though, that foreign news has always been in short supply. In modern times, foreign news has been in short supply. I emphasize that point because if you listen to foreign correspondents, they are always saying, not always, but often saying, oh my God, foreign news is declining. In fact, foreign news is always declining in the sense that there are brief moments of huge foreign news coverage. What's the obvious case for that? War. And then as soon as which by the way is really what? A local story. It's about your kids going overseas and being exposed. Once that's over, there's always a decline. I did a little study and went and looked at what would happen after each war and how there would be pieces, for example, in the Saturday Review, which was a very fine magazine. And after every war, there was a story about the end of the foreign correspondent. But in fact, if you look at coverage and the amount of space in newspapers devoted to foreign news, it's been pretty much the same was pretty much all throughout the 20th century if you take out the wars. Okay, so that's I think a major point, and it's one for us to understand today that it's not that things are getting so much worse. They're changing, and in some ways they're worse because we're losing some of those boutique corps of foreign correspondents I talked about with the Newsday and Philadelphia Inquirer and so forth. But there are other things happening as well. I'm going to get into that, but I want to go to the third factor that's been a huge a huge determinant in foreign reporting, and that's been technology. Throughout, until recently, the mantra for all journalists has been to get news as quickly as possible and get it home as quickly as possible. That actually hasn't been a bad goal, as long as you couldn't really do it. I liken it to our situation today to being one where a dog is constantly trying to chase his tail, and all of a sudden it gets it. And then have you ever seen the look on a dog's face like, what do I do now? Well, in a sense, that's, I think, where we are with foreign news. Journalists for decades talked about the idea of annihilation of space and time. And of course, we had a steady march toward that. First we have wire, or telegraph, and then we have transatlantic cables, and then we have radio, wireless, and the list goes on. But in every one of those iterations until recently, the foreign correspondent found it very difficult on a routine basis to be sure that they could send a story. And in many cases, when they were out on big stories that took them away from major cities, one of the major things they had to worry about was trying to find a place where they could send their story. And foreign correspondents are full of the things they had to do to try to send their stories, and some of them are really quite amusing. And just to mention one, a friend of mine pointed out one time, this was in the 50s, he was in India, he couldn't send the story, he actually got behind the desk and sent the thing on the telex himself, because the guy who didn't know how to use the telex, he was out to lunch, somebody was out to lunch who knew how to do it. And so this was a very common problem. The beginning of the century, it was even using the post. You'd write a story. And you may remember, a short while ago, I mentioned William Howard Russell, the famous correspondent. He loathed the idea that the cables came along. He said he didn't understand how you could write news by lightning, and that what you really want to do is write a long letter that explained what was going on. But when you got to the 30s, I would argue, you had a pretty good balance. You could send stories pretty quickly, but you weren't in touch with the home office all the time. So foreign correspondents were out and able to work relatively independently without the home office being there to tell them what to do. I'm going to, as with several other things I mentioned, I'm going to say more about that in a minute. But let's talk about perhaps some of the positive sides of the technology. In the era we're in now, there are still the elite foreign correspondents. They're still here. The Chicago Daily News is gone. The Tribune doesn't have what it had before. The Washington Post doesn't have what it had before. But the New York Times is doing a good job. The AP has more than it had before. John's old operation, even though their stock was going way down, managed to keep foreign correspondents out there in a way that was really, to my mind, and I'm not saying it because he's here, heroic, that they figured out how they didn't care. I mean, they cared, they were losing money, but they realized that that was something that made them different and could make them proud of being a really great, legitimate news operation. And so there are still people out there who think that way. The Wall Street Journal has improved what it's doing. And so there are some real good examples, I think, of foreign news reporting out there that's still good, and you can't just say everything's gone to hell. And we're still going to have those elite foreign correspondents around. But we also now have a whole lot of other foreign correspondents that I've tried to categorize that are not elites and that don't look like elites and are a kind of, frankly, a change in the way foreign news gathering is done today. First, although I should also say that some of these examples I'm going to give you are these new types of foreign correspondents. We can find in history sort of antecedents for them. One I call the foreign correspondent, and that's a foreign national who works for an American news organization. Now, let me say something historically about that. There was a time when newspapers first got going that they almost only used foreign reporters from overseas. And in fact, it wasn't until shortly before World War I the New York Times realized and decided that they had to stop hiring Brits to send them news to their wire service. They needed to send their own people overseas. And that was actually there's a lot of correspondence in the files about that. And there have always been foreign nationals who have worked for major news organizations, but it hasn't become the norm. The norm has been an American or somebody who's attached to the newspaper and effectively Americanized. But that's begun to change. And in fact, one way it's changed, and a very interesting way it's changed, is most foreign correspondents, especially when they're working in difficult circumstances, wars, or where they're working in places they haven't worked before, hire fixers, people to help them get things done in developing countries even fully developed countries can have lots of complicated things you have to do in order to do your story. A lot of these fixers have now become reporters for newspapers. They become a very important part of what newspapers do overseas. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. There was a survey done now a long time ago, but in 2000, that found that 69% of foreign correspondents for American news organizations were not Americans. And they outnumbered Americans in virtually every medium. And as I say, I think we're going to see more and more of that. The Baghdad bureau chief for McClatchy, John may know this quote, referred to fixers as, quote, journalists in their own right and the backbone of our coverage. So that's one kind that I think has become a new and important kind. A second kind is what I'd call the local foreign correspondent. That's someone who could cover the world from their hometowns. This is a seeming contradiction, I understand, but it's come about because of global interdependence. In 2004, the Radio and Television News Directors Foundation did a survey and found that 2/3 of local broadcasters said they had integrated world and local news into their newscasts. We're in a new era now, said one of them, in which the ambiguity in what is international and what is not international is very great. Actually, many years ago, when I worked at the World Bank, I did a project just on this. I traveled all of the United States proving I could go to any community and I could write about foreign news without ever leaving. And it's become much more a norm. Now, it's not the same thing as an elite trained foreign correspondent to be overseas. But with modern travel being what it is, also a technological advance, of course, because travel is not only faster but cheaper than it had been in the past, a person can get a story, get on a plane, and go cover it, even in a smaller market. And we see more and more of that happening now. The next kind of foreign correspondent that I would talk about is the parachute foreign correspondent. Now, this is a term that's been used very derisively, as in, we should have our foreign correspondents everywhere. They should really know what's going on. They've got infinite experience in that area, and so they can fall back on it. But in fact, historically, we've always had parachute foreign correspondents because there are so many countries and so few reporters. Even the New York Times, when it has 40 people, can't cover all of those countries. And so they have somebody in the Horn of Africa, and they have somebody in the southern cone of Latin America. You always had to travel from one place to another. But now what we do more is we actually purposefully send out journalists from the home office to cover foreign news. And oftentimes this can be, instead of a pejorative, it can be a very positive thing. You watch with this coverage of this Pope, the number of newspapers who will send somebody to Italy who knows a lot about religion coverage. And I ask you, would you rather have somebody who happened to be based in the Mediterranean or in Rome cover that story as a general assignment reporter effectively, or somebody who actually really knew about the Catholic Church and its traditions? And I think some of the best reporting that's been done with the election of the last Pope was newspapers like the Chicago Tribune, when they had foreign correspondents, not only had their foreign correspondent there, but they had somebody who covered it from the religious beat back home. And you get much better coverage that way. So to assume that somehow, you can't, unless you're living there, you can't be a good reporter, doesn't take into account that sometimes you send somebody overseas because they're a subject matter expert. They know a lot about a certain kind of story. The Washington Post in recent years, for example, has had people who had subject matter expertise, and they covered that expertise, national security issues, for example. That was their beat. And I think there's a lot to be said for that, and we shouldn't just dismiss it. The next would be the premium foreign correspondent. I've never found a name I particularly like for it, but it's the best I can come up with. And a good example of that is Bloomberg News. If you take all the foreign correspondents that we've lost, the mainstream foreign correspondence, that traditional foreign correspondent that we've lost, say, in the last 15 years, it probably doesn't equal 1/3 of the number of people that Bloomberg has put abroad as reporters and editors. And that doesn't count the fact that there are other news media, specialized news media, that are highly gated. Bloomberg costs you, what's it now, still $1,600 to get a terminal, something like that, a month?
About
20 a year.
about 20 a year.
20 a year, yeah, about $1,600 a month, right? So that's expensive. So most of us aren't buying that for ourselves. The Polk Awards just came out. Bloomberg won Polk Awards. Didn't they win the Polk? Two Polk Awards. That's a big jump from the fact that when Bloomberg News first got started, they wouldn't allow it to even be accredited in Congress because they said it wasn't really a news organization. Because, of course, the traditional journalists being very conservative, honestly, about how they see the profession. Didn't want anybody in there who wasn't doing things exactly the way they had done it for eons. But it's not just Bloomberg. Reuters has specialized in news. The Economist has got a special unit that does things. There are others that are doing things as well. And they provide very good coverage. It's a problem that it's not there for everybody, although even then, Bloomberg does allow its news to be used by other newspapers as long as they credit it and they don't put it on their wire. They have to only put it on the ink on paper version. That's still the case, right? Yes. Then there's another category, one that actually, if somebody's looking for a dissertation or a thesis project, this is a great project. It hasn't been fully wrestled to the ground. And that's what I call the in-house foreign correspondent. When foreign news services got started, like Reuters started out in the mid-19th century as a banking service. The idea was, and in fact, even in a way, the AP started out as a banking service. The idea was, as we all know, one of the groups that always cares about financial news is who? Business people. Because you want to know what's going on in markets and you want to know what's going on abroad because it has a real tangible impact on what you do every day. Reuters started out by just making sure that prices from various bourses were on the wire at the same time every day so everybody saw them. It then evolved into, obviously, into a wire service. So in a way, it was kind of an in-house foreign service. But we now have all kinds of large companies that get their own news. They have people abroad who are effectively reporters, who find out things they want to know. Now, sometimes they're not writing features on something cute. You know, there's no queer sprigs of gentility in their reporting. But they're going out and looking for things that are in their bailiwick, things that have an impact on their bottom line, and they're reporting on them. Some of this comes in over a wire. There are daily reports put together by many corporations. Some, like FedEx, even have their own, frankly, their own video service, their own television network. It's a very hard story to do because since it's proprietary, they don't have any inclination or any value in telling people what's going on. But if somebody could get inside and find a couple of these to do a case study, I think we learn a lot about a new way that, a lot more than I'm able to tell you here about how foreign reporting, how one aspect of foreign reporting is evolving. Just to give you one that I found that I thought was fascinating was Alcoa's aerospace division hired a firm headed by a former AP reporter to cover the annual Paris show. A reporter and a photographer sent material to London where it was edited by a former Reuters reporter to be put on the Alcoa website. I found out all about this when I gave a talk to a bunch of executives several years ago. One corporate communications chief said to me, "It's all about I've got news." So that's yet another category. For another one, try the citizen foreign correspondent, whose work appears, as you all know, in a myriad of ways. In a way, I guess you could say they're like Benjamin Franklin's letter writers, people who sent something in. They weren't trained to be journalists, but they told you what was going on abroad. By the way, the plague has just appeared in Genoa, and that ends up being a story in Franklin's newspaper. On the scenes observers. And of course, you all know, you probably can all cite more examples than I can. One obvious one was all the Twitter that was going on when Mumbai had the terrorist attack. Peter Moss of the New York Times Magazine had this to say about Salam Pax, a young Iraqi architect who posted dispatches on his website during the U.S. invasion of Iraq. He said he was better than any army of foreign correspondents. And of course, Salam Pax went on to be actually a traditional foreign correspondent, which tells you something. He got hired by a British newspaper. And then last of all, we can talk about the foreign local correspondent. And that's the correspondent who is accessed by citizen editors, people here, say, in the United States, who no longer have to wait around for somebody to deliver them the newspaper. An example of this type of correspondent is an Indian journalist working for a New Delhi newspaper whose work is accessed via the internet by somebody who lives in Indianapolis. You can read the newspaper overseas. And so in a way, those people become your foreign correspondents. The local reporter in Delhi becomes your foreign correspondent if you want to get access to him. Okay, we know there's some good things about this and some bad things. We know that citizen journalists can be very good. We know that citizen journalists can put out a lot of information that's rubbish. We know that Bloomberg and entities like that can do very high quality journalism and have a tremendous ethic, I think, to do that, because they come out of good environments where they have good training. But not everybody can get access to them, so it kind of creates haves and have-nots. We know that it's a good thing to have that local news stations, for example, can send somebody overseas to do a story, but we know it's not the same thing. There's a limitation because they oftentimes lack experience working abroad as a reporter and so forth. Clearly, technology has, as always happens in history, has its pluses and its minuses. And so I want to end on this point that I talked about earlier, which is what are the implications for diplomacy. First of all, foreign news has played a very important role in diplomacy, because reporters can go out on their own often, especially in those periods where they were not saddled to a bureau and didn't have the editor back at home telling them what to do all the time, and find out news that other people didn't know things about. And because in many cases they had so much experience and were so steeped in their subject that they could, what they wrote was very insightful. One of my favorite foreign correspondents, I have maybe a small list of half a dozen, is a guy named Vincent Sheehan. Vincent Sheehan was a genius. He was a master of many languages. He lived abroad for many, many years. He wrote a book that is one of the great, great books called Personal History that actually established a whole genre of reporting by first-person reporting, although no one ever equaled him because his writing was of such high quality. He was also crazy, but crazy in a way that was sometimes unbelievable. So once he had been in India. He was a Catholic who was very tormented about his Catholicism. He sometimes would have conversations with Jesus, who would come down and see him, like at the breakfast table, because his kids told me Jesus would be right there. He'd have nervous breakdowns once in a while. But one time, he decided that Gandhi was going to be assassinated by a Hindu. And he had such great stature, he went to a newspaper and said, "Send me to India." They sent him to India. It took him a while to get there because he went to the Salzburg Festival because he wanted to go listen to opera. And then he had to go visit the Grand Mufti in Palestine. And then he got drunk in Pakistan. And then he ends up in India, tells Gandhi he wants to join his ashram, and he's there when Gandhi is assassinated. He figured it out. He once said, one of his great friends was John Gunther, and he once said, at a dinner party, John Gunther has just died. He was in New York and John Gunther was in Europe, and John Gunther had just died. I mean, he wasn't sick, he just died. So Sheehan was a character. He had this capacity to understand, and one of the great stories he wrote, and I use it in my book, is he went to Austria during the Anschluss when the Nazis came in. He was a freelance writer at this point, and he was writing for the New York Herald Tribune, which was a conservative Republican newspaper. Sheehan was more on the liberal side. And he wrote a story that was the lead story in the newspaper. This is a big deal to have a freelancer like this write the lead story. And he says, I think it's such a marvelous piece of journalism. He says, and there are a lot of people who say, he says, I can't give you sources for this. This is at the bottom of his story. But there are a lot of people that say what's happening is the Nazis only appeal to a small group of people. But in fact, they appeal to a very wide swath of society. And the only resolution of this will be a world war. He says, he's honest. He says, I can't give you real sources. I can just tell you after all the work I've done here, this is what's going to happen. And he was right. Paul Scott Maurer was the same way. He wasn't crazy actually. He was a very conservative guy, but he used to talk about he used to perfect a writing technique that he would use to try to write his dispatches as if they were diplomatic cables. Because by the way, they read rather boring today, but you could read Maurer and you really could have sort of knew what was going on in a given country. A very important function that is that helps supplement what our Foreign Service officers, for example, do when they're abroad writing cables. Well, what's happened now is, of course, that a lot of these people are gone. We don't have them. I might add what also has happened is because of technology, and this is the main point, because of technology doing what it's able to do, what we have is Vincent Sheehan would not be allowed to do that kind of reporting because somebody would get back to him and say, what's your sources? I want to know your sources. And by the way, what time did you talk to him? I had a very illuminating experience a couple of years ago when I was out interviewing editors at USA Today. And you know, they had had a very embarrassing experience with a guy named Jack Kelly had been caught making up stories, foreign correspondent who made up stories. And so to deal with that, what they would do is every time a reporter sent something in, they'd call the reporter up. They'd say, well, did you really talk to that guy? They'd look at all the slips they sent in for their expense account to find out if they were exactly where they said they would be at any one time. Frankly, I think that's preposterous. If somebody wants to make stuff up, they're going to figure out how to do it, even though you're checking up on them all the time. But the problem is, in that kind of environment, what happens is foreign correspondents are on a much shorter leash. And when they're on a shorter leash, they tend to find out things that editors think they ought to be looking for, as opposed to things that they find out all by themselves. In the 1930s, the best newspaper in Washington, D.C. was the Baltimore Sun. Newspapers in Washington weren't that good. Baltimore Sun had a great tradition of foreign reporting. And one of the things, and they weren't the only one, but they're a good example, was when a reporter went abroad, they never heard from the editor again. Now, there could be screw-ups, like 3 reporters one time signed themselves to do the same story in Geneva, and they all ended up there with 3 Baltimore Sun reporters because they didn't check with anybody and nobody knew they were going to be there. That's not efficient. But the plus side was they won Pulitzers for doing wonderful reporting, for example, in India, where the reporter would go out and spend lots of time really understanding what was going on. This becomes even a bigger problem, I would maintain, in a world we live in today where the government apparatus to control news has grown so dramatically. The fight has always been between the government having its agenda and reporters having theirs. And if the sides were, I don't know what equal means, but if you had a lot of people on both sides, it sort of worked. But what we have now is we have a decrease in traditional foreign correspondents and traditional reporters in Washington, and an increase in the capacity of the government to tell its story the way it wants to tell it. And in some cases, that manifests itself in ways that I think are troublesome. I'm working on a book right now on the Committee on Public Information, which was created in World War I, the beginning of all American efforts to control what people thought. It was created a week after we went into war and was both worked in the United States and overseas. And so in the process of working on that, I decided to find out what was going on today. And one of the things that came out of my investigations, as I've talked to now scores of people, are the number of career public affairs officers who feel they can't do their job the way they used to because they're insinuated between them and their job are political appointees who try to spin the news. There are a lot of really dedicated people like many of you who are, like all of you who are going to go in the Foreign Service, who want to do a good job, who are honest. I mean, nobody thinks a public affairs officer is supposed to tell you everything, but they also have certain standards about what they will say and what they won't say because they're dedicated to that as a kind of professional ethic. And a lot of military people are too. I'm very impressed with a lot of them. But in the case of, for example, the war in Iraq, in the lead up to the war in Iraq, there was somebody named Wilkinson who was sent out to help supervise what happened in the press operation, who was from the White House. And nobody could remember a case before that when there was a political operative in charge of military spokespeople. I think that's worrying. And that just makes it more difficult when our reporters are on a short leash and the government has gotten greater power and, to control information. For us as the American public to find out things abroad that are news, as in things we don't already know. I think there are a couple of very good studies to be done in foreign reporting today that help illuminate some of these issues I've talked about, and that's one of them. I've got another one too, which is I think we've got to find some new ways of measuring how many foreign correspondents we actually have. We've got to find a new technique for doing that, and I've been trying to figure out a way to see if I could try that. For those of you who are scholars, it's a wide open field. For those of you who are going to be practitioners, I hope you will see the journalist sometimes as your friend. And I hope you'll do something else. Always read newspapers that have good reporting, because it means they'll make money. And there'll be more of them. Thank you very much.
Some time for questions?
You bet.
You want to just raise a hand? And
Well, Jim, let me, everybody else being shy. Jack, I think the most important point you made is one that we're just beginning to realize. And that is that the balance of power between the government and the press has tipped back in favor of the government, even in this country. And part of that is because the government, you didn't mention it, but the government has seized on the citizen journalism model to generate its own content. And this White House has really doubled down on the efforts of the previous one in terms of interposing, particularly the national security staff, between the spokesman in the Pentagon and the State Department and the intelligence community and the press, so that it's almost impossible for an official in any of those agencies to talk to any of my reporters at Bloomberg without clearing it, almost word for word, with a political appointee in the White House. And the spokesman and everyone else have to report every contact with reporters.
So say that first, that's pretty easy. What was the first one they have to report? So when you say they, you mean the public affairs officers, or?
And anyone else. So, you know, reporting on some of these topics in Washington has become, frankly, more like trying to report in closed countries like Iran and China, where you have to arrange to meet people outside their offices. You can't call them on the phone, can't email them, because there are records of all of that.
What was the first one? You said the first one was they had to report every contact. What was the other one?
That they have to clear everything they say, which causes delays obviously in reporting, but it also means that the message is shaped by political operatives. And so we lose the benefit of the insights of wonderful diplomats like Ryan Crocker and Chris Stevens, you know, and the understanding that folks like that bring to the places where they're posted, because there's now a political appointee who is sitting there judging not the quality of the reporting, but how it fits into the administration's political agenda. Does it look good or bad? So the two striking examples of that I would offer are the coverage of the war in Afghanistan, where there's an attempt to sort of buy enough time to get out and pretend that this was successful, this effort at nation building or coin or whatever you want to call it. And the absence of much reporting on the outcome of leading from behind in Libya, which has, of course, now been drowned out by the Benghazi mania. But you hear very, very little about what's going on in Libya today, or for that matter, Egypt, where we have a fine ambassador serving. But it doesn't fit the agenda. The Arab Spring has not blossomed the way it was expected to. And so that news is less heard. And so the bottom line is that I think in many ways the balance of power has tipped just as you suggested, partly because of the decline of the traditional media, but partly because the government is also able to use these tools of citizen journalism the same way the government in Syria uses them, the government in Iran uses them, the government in China most notoriously uses them. But our government does too.
That's a really great point.
Thank you, sir. My name is James. I have your beautiful book. That's why I'm here today. And I guess everybody should know. I was a journalist myself, and you're right. And what you said, that today's foreign correspondent has little room or much less room than before when they were working overseas. And that exactly happened to me too. But my question is, and do you think today's world...
That may be the only existing copy left of that book.
This is one of my best books. I like it. Since when I was a child, I know this guy, but I never had a chance to read the full biography like that. But I'm glad I have it here, and you're here. That's why I had the chance to talk about. So he's so great that even Richard Nixon, your book said a few months before he died, and wrote him a letter saying you distinct career. But to this world, do you think that we have a better environment to produce great journalists like Alex Snow, or like the New York Times recent report about China's hacking activities? There was a anonymous administration official said, I quote here, huge diplomatic sensitivities there, unquote. So we talk about journalism and diplomatic impact. Thanks.
Right. Well, I've actually wondered about that a lot, and wondered if you could be, who can be Edgar Snow today? To some extent, you have to see Edgar Snow as clearly a product of his times, for the golden age reasons I gave about the amounts of money to be an independent reporter, the fact that there was this clash between communism and fascism, and Americans could have better access. And I feel, and you know what I say in the book, I think he got a bum rap. For those of you who don't know, he effectively ended up having to leave the United States because he was considered by many people, he was one of those who was hunted during the McCarthy period. And he couldn't get published, and he couldn't make a living. So he had gone from being, any number of journalists have told me, Harrison Salisbury, who's now gone, Seymour Topping, who's a good friend of mine, who was the managing editor of the New York Times, and a whole large number of other journalists have said to me that when they started to be journalists, they wanted to be like Edgar Snow. That's why they went out to be journalists. Seymour Topping got out of the military at the end of World War II, and he stays in the Philippines when he's discharged and goes to China because he wants to be like Snow. Snow was not a communist, and but there's another side to that story, right? And that's what happens after communism takes over, and it's hard to get into China to report. And I think Snow is unfairly criticized for not having fully understood what was going on in China, when in fact I think even sometimes people who were living in China didn't understand exactly what was always going on. But it was always in the back of his mind that because he was the only journalist, American journalist, to get back into China after liberation, if he wrote something that was negative, it was going to be a problem for two reasons. One was he might not have his access anymore, but also since he was the only journalist in China, he stopped being just a journalist and he had to start seeing himself as a diplomat. It's a real problem when you're the only person. Then anything you say has much more weight than with a whole bunch of people moving around. And that's his story. For that reason, his story is not an easy one to just put in one category or another. But I would say, you know, there are certainly journalists out there today who are intrepid and who are really courageous. And they're a different kind of reporter than Snow was, but they're still great reporters. But Vincent Sheehan, Snow, and some of those other ones, there aren't many like them anymore. I mean, I don't know. I have trouble thinking out exactly who they would be.
I'm Kathy Stevens. I've been an American Foreign Service officer for over 30 years, and this last comment about Edgar Snow reminded me of something I was thinking of as you were talking, and that is a lot of the changes you've talked about in the world of journalism, and especially foreign correspondence, are things that you could also say about diplomats, particularly reporting officers abroad. You know, some good, some bad, and I thought of it because you know, of my generation, I was inspired to join the Foreign Service because of the China hands, you know, and that record of reporting what they saw and as they saw it, and you know, not being very well received in Washington, but nonetheless, you know, being a very important contribution to our understanding. I could say more about that, but I wanted to also kind of respond to the earlier very interesting point about the balance of power kind of shifting perhaps in favor of the government, if you like. I don't dispute that, and also I think part of it is that diplomats, like journalists, are, you know, more in touch with headquarters and therefore in some ways on kind of a tighter leash in some ways. But I would also say this: it's been my observation that kind of what journalists are interested in and the rules they operate under have changed. And this is my illustration. I served in places. Korea was one in the 1980s as it went through a very volatile political period, the Balkans in the 90s, where mid and upper level foreign service officers at embassies, up to the ambassador, some of the ambassadors always a different category, usually always on the record, but those reporting officers would have frequent background briefings with journalists. One-on-one, you'd be friends, you'd trade, you had a shared interest in what you were reporting. You know, it was kind of good if your bosses in Washington didn't read a different story in the New York Times from what they saw on your cable, or at least that they took into account each other in a sense. But also you're just interested, and you would do background briefings, and that is still possible, my point being. I was in Korea these last 3 or 4 years. I have to say that one of the things I noted, and part of this is because there aren't as many foreign correspondents, but the American journalists weren't interested in background briefings. They can't write stories based upon them. They feel they have other better sources. They don't go to the diplomats for it. So, you know, maybe it's because everything needs to be on the record now. It seems to me as a non-journalist, there have been some changes in the practice of journalism too that change that relationship. It's not all the tight leash from Washington. And finally, the other thing I just wanted to raise, and kind of related to that, was one thing I've observed, if you look at foreign correspondence, I'm not sure where it falls in your list, is the fact that a lot of the foreign news we get, whether here in the United States or elsewhere in the world, comes from media that is either state-supported or state-owned. You know, Al Jazeera is owned by Qatar and is an increasingly important source of foreign news around the world. China has a very active effort. The United States, of course, has BBG with the VOA and so on, and that's not for U.S. consumption, but if you look at where the foreign reporting is coming from, it's increasingly from these sources, and of course the BBC, you know. I think that's a trend that, is important.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's become more pronounced even since I did this book. You're right. I don't really push it. John's going to make a comment about something you said. I can tell by the way he's fidgeting.
No, I mean, I think you're right. And I think it tracks back to something Jack said, which is that news companies are struggling to survive financially. And so the contents of the background briefing are not going to attract as many clicks as some on-the-record comment by some. And so a lot of the ability to measure audience interest that you talked about in the middle of the 19th century is back big time with the internet, because the tools for measuring not just how many clicks, but time on site, the demographics of who read the story, which are now predominant. We'd rather have 5 people who make $500,000 a year read the story than 100 people who make $50,000 a year. That's what advertisers care about. All of that helps drive the news agenda, and I think compounds the problem that you correctly talked about, Kathy. So the financial part of journalism has intruded, as has the speed part of the problem, to change the way we look at news. And it's the opposite of what you were holding up, I think, Jack, as the story that takes time to develop, but probably does the most important thing a foreign correspondent can do, and that is to help Americans see the world through other people's eyes, not through our own. That to me is the highest calling of a foreign correspondent.
Empathy.
Well, not just empathy, but to show the, you know, we deal in stereotypes. Currently it's Islam. But to take somebody somewhere else and show them how the world looks. You know, in the case of the Arab Spring, the extent to which that was not about some aspiration for Western democracy, but about to get the policeman's hand out of my pocket. And after 4 years of college, to give me the opportunity to have a job. Not a Western style separation of church and state, separation of powers in the government.
You know, you made great points. I want to comment on one, and I suppose this will categorize me as a more of a reporter than an editor, but still I stand by it. I think I think we oversource news today, or we over-attribute it. And you know, it's complicated. I mean, obviously, if you look at the way Europeans write, they don't have any sources. And I remember working with a European journalist one time. I said, let's go interview. He said, I don't need to interview that guy. I know more about this than he does. I think, well, that's not the way we think, right? But we've gotten into, I think, journalism's declining credibility because of big problems like Jason Blair and things like that, and just other problems because people think journalists are biased and politically and so forth, has led journalists to try to be more and more careful and more proving that they're reliable to the point that they become, I think, more boring. You know, I recognize that there's a downside to what I'm about to say, but I think letting journalists go out and really write and having some pizzazz would help. I remember one time, I read this obit, this is 25 years ago, of this guy who was a reporter. And one of the things he did when he was a reporter was he was told that he had to go cover a wedding. And so when he came back, he wrote only about what the groom wore, not what the bride wore. What a great story. What fun, right? You'd read that story. The newspaper would be a lot more fun if it had people who just did things that were a little crazy once in a while. But you'd never do that today. I mean, no, they wouldn't let you do it, and they'd make you get 6 sources for it. And you know, I mean, I think that's very unfortunate. And I think your example is a really interesting one. That becoming really expert on some of these things that seem anodyne isn't seen as having a market value. There are some exceptions to that rule, and I know you know that. I recognize you know that, but unfortunately, I think it's more prevalent.
Yeah, David Galbraith from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy and also a Foreign Service officer. I was wondering, you talked a lot about the changes in foreign correspondence as seen through the different types of correspondence out there and the changes over time in that. But your comment made me think of, obviously most of us probably get our news through the elite sources from the elite journalists, but how is, from the perspective of the consumer, far beyond the Beltway in the United States, how is that person's, if it's possible to categorize, intake of foreign news changing in terms of its composition and sort of volume?
Yeah, so that's a really big point. One of the smartest things the New York Times ever did was that it put on computer data, first of all, it made sure it had a record of its newspaper that was first available on microfilm and then available electronically, historically. So anytime somebody's going to go do a study of journalism, they go look at the New York Times. And then they say, so this is what journalism is like. But how many people read the New York Times? I mean, it's a very small number of people. And so we began to, even though it does a very good job, that's not necessarily what the average person gets. And so oftentimes we don't know I don't think we know very well what people get out there because we don't have the mechanisms for going to find out. Now, there have been studies that look at foreign news coverage, particularly amount. And I referred to that sort of obliquely. I've done one myself where I got a database from 1928, and then I went and replicated that for the same newspapers all throughout. In fact, I had a doctoral student do a dissertation doing it. And it showed that the amount of news was roughly, the news hole was roughly the same in newspapers that were non-elite newspapers. So by number, we kind of, by volume, I guess, we know it's been fairly constant. But there's also there's 2 other problems, right? What's the content of those stories? But mostly that content is going to be driven by wire services, AP, that kind of thing, or when the New York Times and Chicago Daily News, when it was around, had its stories on the wire. So there's a way to kind of understand what that is, and so that's sort of one technique. But then the other thing is, a lot of journalists make the case, and I have to say I was one when I was a foreign reporter and came back and made this case. Americans would like a lot more foreign news if they could get it. I don't believe it anymore. I don't think it's true. I'll use myself as an example. There are countries that I know fairly well because I've been a reporter in them, and there are countries that I don't know very well, and that when I see a story on them, if you say to me, I'm not going to tell you what the countries are because I don't want you to know my ignorance, but let's just take X country. And if you said to me, should there be more news from X country? I'd say, sure, of course, we should have more news from that country. But on Sunday morning, you know, I get up, I've got a lot to do, and there's a long story from that country, and I read the first couple of paragraphs, and think, I don't know what the hell's going on in that country. I don't know who those people are. I don't know who the political parties are, and I don't read it. I mean, and I'm, you know, that's sort of how I've made my living caring about foreign news. We can't possibly, all of us, care about all of those things out there that happen in the world. It's not practical. What I think we have to think about, this is a very personal view, probably obvious. I think what we have to be concerned about is there's a flow of information that's out there for people who want it and use it, and it can shape the debate. And not everybody has to read it. The wonderful miracle, and this doesn't exist today, and that's a problem. It's not just about whether you have more foreign correspondents or fewer. The wonderful miracle about the mass market newspaper was that it had a way to do cross-subsidization. So you had to have sports reporting, and you had a little foreign news in there, and you had a little of this, and you had a little of that. And advertisers, because that's what you got. I mean, if you live in a community, you're going to get, you know, one, or maybe if you're lucky, you had two papers. Advertisers wanted to be in that paper. They wanted to get as many eyeballs as they could in that paper. So they'd pay a lot of money. You know, you got your paper for free, basically. All you paid was the delivery cost. The advertisers paid the cost of the paper. And what happened was you got a little bit of everything in that paper. You may not care about chess puzzles, but you got a chess puzzle on Sunday. And you may not have cared about foreign news, but you got foreign news. And maybe you didn't care about reporting sports, but you got that. And because foreign news was expensive and may have had a small audience, a lot of newspapers felt they ought to have somewhat of a larger share of it, or a substantial amount. And they could justify it because of the cross-subsidization, because there was a lot of money put in that paper to make that work. Now with the fragmentation of news, so you can only get foreign news and you can only get sports news, what happens? People pay all kinds of money for sports news, right? They get the fantasy football, they pour all kinds of money to get, because they really want, I'm at LSU, right? I mean, we really like sports. Some more than me. I'm not the greatest sports fan, but you know, I mean, there are more people that make money on just LSU sports, and spell LSU sports websites, which are gated and have costs involved, and sell advertising. There aren't comparable sites that have those kind of eyeballs for foreign affairs. So once you've fragmented these subject areas, ones that are perhaps more important politically, but also really expensive, and don't have audience interest, relatively lower audience interest, they have a problem.
I'm Brian Beery. I'm a Washington correspondent for a European newspaper called Europolitics. And I just want to make a point about the internet and the challenge that poses to reporters. Because you know, one of the great things is the internet makes everything available instantly. So then the challenge for a reporter is, well, what can you give extra that the person can't just get on the internet? So that goes not just for picking up your Bloomberg articles or your New York Times articles, but even if you want a speech, you can get it on YouTube instantly, because someone will have uploaded it on YouTube. And transcripts, you know, the State Department will put out the text instantly, so you can cut and paste automatically your quotes. So it's always a challenge for me, but what I try to do is just to try and find an angle that no one else, or a story that no one else is chasing. That's the solution that I found. It's actually relatively easy in my case, because I'm the only person who covers EU-US relations from the perspective of the EU institutions and the US, which often surprises people that there's nobody else in Washington doing that. So I can get around it because of my particular niche area, but just wanted to mention the point about, as great as the internet is, that forces journalists to be kind of better in a way. What would you?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So you're able to do it because you don't have competition in that niche. Yeah. That's sort of, you know, the equivalent of that is why network broadcasting ended up having fewer foreign correspondents. When there were only 3 networks and only 2 of them, NBC and CBS, had foreign news, that was the only place you could get foreign news. So you could spend a lot of money on foreign news, which they had to do, and they had bureaus all over, and you got an audience for that. There's always tension, and the trouble with war is that there's always this view that you got to decide how much of a patriot you are, and it starts to be more like sports reporting in some ways than it does like basic reporting, because you're on a side. That's an oversimplification, because there are many journalists who obviously have managed to tell stories that didn't need to be told. But I'll say two things that maybe put it a little higher, loftier plane. I think one of the things, some work that's been done in the last years that I think is very important work, is called indexing. I don't know if anyone's here is familiar with it in political science. And it's all that I know of has been used to apply to foreign reporting, and mostly reporting in conflicts. And what it shows is that as soon as, contrary to what journalists like to think about themselves, journalists are very reluctant in times of crisis to report stories that go against the consensus of what political leaders think. When the president and all the president's people and Congress believe something is a good story, it's very hard for them to break out of that story mold. We have a very good example of that with Vietnam. We have a very good example of that with the war in Iraq. There are, of course, there were a couple of people like Senator Byrd who said something, and some of us may remember him getting up and giving a speech, but the consensus was so rock solid, as it was in Vietnam, that it was very hard to get ahead of that story. And of course, today we have many journalists and editors who are very sorry about the way they handled that. It so happens Knight Ridder was one of the few stories that managed to write a different story about what was happening with the weapons of mass destruction and all. But Knight Ridder wasn't. Its newspapers were not in the main metropolitan news-making areas. And so I'm not trying to take anything away from them, because I don't want to do that. They did a good job. But they weren't in the places where it made as much difference. And so this becomes a real problem. And I think it's such an interesting aspect of American journalism. The more responsible you are, the more difficult it is to provide counter narratives during times of crisis. So the New York Times, I'll tell you this story. I love this story. One of my great heroes is Harrison Salisbury. Wonderful, tough journalist. And some of you may remember the story. He goes to North Vietnam. He secretly goes. Nobody knew he was going to get there except Clifton Daniel at the New York Times and a couple other people. He gets into North Vietnam. He lands. And he was an associate editor in those days. And he hated the Washington Bureau. He thought the Washington Bureau was always in bed with politicians. And he was just a really tough reporter. He was thrown out of college even because he wrote stories that the administrators didn't like at the University of Minnesota. He was just a great journalist. He lands on the ground on Christmas Eve in Hanoi and starts writing and says civilians are being bombed. Stories arrive back at the New York Times. The first night, they don't know what the hell to do with him. This guy is sitting there. My God, I didn't know Harrison Salisbury. He calls up Clifton Daniel. He says, Clifton Daniel says, run him. Turns out, first of all, Harrison Salisbury, which was typical of him, he didn't have any sources. He just said it. The New York Times then, becoming very nervous about this, the next day when they get his copy and they just put in, according to sources, they just throw it in because they knew he talked to these people. I mean, how the hell would he know? But they wanted to have sources, so they write in according to North Vietnamese sources. Then they send him a cable and said, would you please put sources in the stories, which he then does. But here's the really interesting part of that story. There was a guy named Hanson Baldwin who had covered the Pentagon for years and years and years. And he was a good reporter, but he was also really close to those people in the Pentagon. He writes a letter. I've seen it. I was in the archives. Managed to get in. He writes a letter to the editor, to the, who does he write to? He writes to the managing editor. And he says, I can't believe that Harrison Salisbury can write these stories. I think this is appalling. So the editor says, fine, you go write a counter story and put it in the paper. And then they had another one by Drew Middleton that came out of the UN. Counter stories to counter what Harrison Salisbury had said. Now, if Baldwin had written a story saying what the military point of view was, and Harrison Salisbury had come into the newsroom and said, well, that doesn't give the North Vietnamese, their side of the story, they wouldn't say, well, Harrison, you better go write a story about what they say, right? It tells you sort of what the mindset is, because the Times doesn't like to be seen as a crusader. That doesn't mean they don't break stories and all that, but they don't like being too far out there in this kind of environment. Anyway, Salisbury keeps writing these stories, and of course, what happened? He was right. He was right. They bombed civilians. And he was denied a Pulitzer Prize because the board couldn't bring itself to, the split board. They had to have 2 votes, as I recall. He had won another one on Soviet Union. But anyway, that's always this, I think the most interesting problem of war reporting is not just the rules, which is a big deal. It's this trying to do reporting in an environment where where everybody's lines are so hard, and where it becomes very complicated, and where, like jiu-jitsu, you use somebody's power, their own weight against them. The New York Times has its own weight used against it because it's so big it doesn't want to screw up.
I'm afraid we're just about out of time. I was taking careful notes throughout this talk, and in addition to being a great discussion, I think we got about 6 or 7 research assignments for the group here. Thank you for that. Thank you so much for this great talk.
Thank you for coming.